Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a little bit of time since you might have seen something looking like that on the screen. And there's a reason for that. We have some Mythgard patch notes, and oh baby, are they massive. So let's jump into it. For anyone out there who has found the Random's Thoughts channel either here on YouTube or the live stream, which by the way, if you're catching this on YouTube, hit up the live stream RTChompGG over on Twitch. And of course, the likes and subscribes help. All the links in the description, you know, the usual sellout thing. But you got to do it. That's the way the algorithm works, right? For anybody who was originally here for Phobies or for other games that I've streamed or other games that I played, Mythgard was kind of my, we'll call it my first big game. When I was streaming, I streamed some other stuff. They were popular games. I never really got a whole lot of traction from a viewership perspective or anything like that. But Mythgard absolutely was massive as far as my personal stream. And it's a game that I really was attached to for a variety of reasons. And I'll give you a few ideas. Like, it just hit at a good time. Like, I was getting out of another game, and then I found Mythgard, and the mechanics drew me in. The art drew me in. The world building, the mythos drew me in. There were a ton of things. Oh, and by the way, as a competitive player, they also had a massive, massive tournament scene. Since then, unfortunately, Mythgard had gone into maintenance mode, which means that they weren't getting further updates. But the big news between then, the maintenance mode, and now was that the company got bought and the game got bought. And the new overlords seem to be pushing the game again. So one of the first things that we're getting, although we have gotten post-maintenance mode patches, balance patches specifically, this is the biggest one, far and away. And there are enormous changes in the world of Mythgard, and we're going to talk about them one by one right now. So as you can see over there, there's a few different cards, and anybody, and chat's here with me, a lot of, well, I was going to say faces, but a lot of names that I haven't seen in a while that are coming back to talk about this amazing game. I'm going to read out what's stated here in the balance changes, and then we'll actually dive into them themselves. So the live balance changes for August 2022. We recently offered a survey to the Mythgard community to collect feedback on the game with a particular focus on card balance. In response to that feedback, the next update includes 20 card balance changes. First of all, that's an enormous amount of cards to be changing. And they are massive pillars in the game. Obviously inserted by me. Although we prioritize community feedback, these changes came from a mix of survey responses, collected game analytics, and our in-house design team. All right, other thing to add. I love the sound of that it wasn't just the community responses. Because while, and I've talked about this before, and I hope people don't take this as insulting, but look, communities tend to be great at identifying problems, but not necessarily at fixing them. And even identifying the problems can be, we'll say, influenced by other factors. So, moving on with the rest of the statement. Please note that these changes will not be live in-game yet and will be released sometime in the coming days. We will communicate before and at the time these changes take effect. We'll be monitoring community feedback and in-game data, and we'll follow up with additional changes should they be needed. So already, great start. Love to hear it that all these things are still in motion from before and continuing and will continue in the future. That it's not just going to be, here, we're going to throw this out there and call it a day. I just realized a bunch of stuff fell off my desk, I guess, when I was upstairs. Sorry. Distracted for a second. My little predator dogs, which, by the way, I want to see the movie Prey. I'm hoping I can watch tomorrow night, but little predator dogs from the movie Predators, they fell off the shelf above my desk. Anyway, random aside. But as to the actual changes, and I see chat already is chiming in with a number of their own comments on a few different things. We're just going to go top to bottom. We'll circle back at the end for final thoughts. And like I said, anybody who wants to throw in things in between, feel free to. Now, at the start, I admittedly haven't really played Mythgard since it went into maintenance mode. I had played for a while and then just kind of fell off. So a lot of these opinions and ideas are probably going to be very outdated. Realistically, if you have been keeping up with the game you're probably going to be in a better position to judge than I am. I'm basing it on my previous experiences and when I was a tournament competitor in that game. I was able to top 8 a few of the events, but ultimately, this is just me speculating. These are my hot takes. Clearly, there's going to be a time and a place to actually check them out. So, first one up is Allfather's Horn. As you can see on the left here, we have the original version. This one on the right is the new change version. This, far and away, and I appreciate, while this is likely just in alphabetical order, I didn't check, but I do appreciate that this one is at the top. Because Allfather's Horn, I have to imagine, was in, if not 100% of the surveys, damn near close. Because this thing induced arguably the most frustrating gameplay experiences and the most absurd oops, I win scenarios where, as I always tended to put it, you had to always clear your opponent's entire board every single turn from the moment that they could hypothetically play an Allfather's Horn until the game ended. And if you played any sort of card game where you actually, have a board and interact with a board, guess what? That's a hell of a lot of effort. That's not easy for a lot of decks. And I think Allfather's Horn had a very specific purpose to fight Dirtle decks. It allowed you to say, hey, you're going to play a deck that doesn't do anything until turn 12 billion. Well, guess what? You can't, because I'm going to Allfather's Horn and just murder your face whenever I have the opportunity. And leaving even one minion, possibly, sometimes 2, on the board is enough to result in a dead opponent. So if you play a super Dirtle-heavy, Greedlord McSweaty-Pants type deck, Allfather's Horn was the bane of your existence. However, due to the Rainbow Path and a number of other ramp effects that could hypothetically happen, it allowed an Allfather's Horn to just explosively end the game really, really early. And from almost literally out of nowhere. Like, you should not be expecting to die from the board states that Allfather's Horn could eliminate you from. So, my initial inclination is great. This goes from 7 to 10 mana. It now also costs like 11 billion gems because, okay, we're going from 2 blue gems to 5 blue gems. So now this is reserved for, like, mono blue decks. Possibly. We'll have to see. I like the anti-stall dynamic. I'm checking out chat here. You don't like the aggro combo killing you on turn 5? There's also no gem refresh. Yes, I didn't complete speaking about it, but it used to previously refresh your mana in gems, but now it just refreshes your mana. There's a variety of different things that Allfather's Horn did and now no longer can do. Is it dead? I'll be honest with you, I don't have the foggiest idea. This is still an enormously powerful effect. Getting to do these things could be insane, but the limitations on this seem to really, really restrict it. I don't necessarily have a problem with the Allfather's Horn combo finish, hypothetically, in a vacuum, the theoretical sense. But the problem I tend to have is it had too many oops, I win, where there's just basically, it felt as though there was no counterplay. Was there counterplay? Possibly. But if you're playing a card game, and chat will hopefully back me up. Maybe they won't. They'll tear me apart. Who knows? Let me know in the comments if you want to tear me apart. Go ahead. But you play a card game, you're trying to play to averages. You're trying to play to, well, what do they likely have? What are they setting up for? And trying to outsmart and outposition your opponent. The reality is you can't, for a lot of the scenarios that Allfather's Horn was presenting, where I didn't feel that way. So I am personally happy with this change. It may have not just kneecapped it, but taken it out behind the shed and shot it. We'll have to see. And again, just like I said at the beginning, I've been kind of out of the game, literally and figuratively, for a while. So take it with a grain of salt. Maybe this will be okay. Maybe Valkyries still get value out of this. I was actually playing that in the last qualifier. And, I mean, it's a Valkyrie spell. You can see it right here. So maybe that is now the intended home, and this is the finisher for that deck. How they're getting to 10 mana necessarily is I guess, a different question. But mono blue aggro has its final closer. And that, off the top of my head, is probably the only place it fits. Rainbow Valk? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking, Midge. I think the 10 mana keeps it out of the hands of anything vaguely aggressive. I could see with Rainbow ramping into the 10 somehow. Like, what that exact scenario is, I couldn't tell you right now. But I don't think it's impossible. Just not very likely at the moment. That being said, I'm open to being incorrect on this. So, feel free to drop other Allfather's Horn thoughts in. We're going to move on, but I can come back to it if we need to. So, next up is Armageddon Angel. Was 7 cost, now 9 cost, was a 3/7, now a 7/7. And it used to have this weird, not weird, but unique variable stat line. Variable stat line for depending on what was destroyed, what survived, that sort of thing. Now it's just a static 7/7. It still has its Awaken, and it goes from 3 orange gems to 6. So, similar to Allfather's Horn, this seems to be, you're playing mono orange if you want this thing. The damage, like, or rather the attack and health thing is just kind of, I don't know. It seems that I didn't have a problem with it before. I think it's fine to clean it up and make it quote unquote simpler. I mean, it is simpler, right? Like, there's just straight up less things to worry about for it. Making it 9 feels a little bad. Personally, I never really had a problem with Armageddon Angel. I thought, especially in the context of Mythgard, where so many things were busted, the game was intended to have a ton of super powerful cards, hence the deck building constraints for Mythics. They were intended to be impactful, and hopefully, you know, you get your one usage of it, and then if your opponent eliminates it or prevents it, counteracts it, whatever, then, okay, that thing's gone, and they don't have to worry about it anymore. That isn't quite how it always worked out, and we'll see that in some of the other changes. But in this case, the Armageddon Angel, I truly didn't really have a problem with it. I know that it was very much it had a target on its back with the community. I know a lot of people really didn't like it, and I just disagree. I don't know. I never really had a problem with it. The fact that it is getting changed, though, okay, I can live with this. The big thing to keep in mind with this and all the changes, and I don't even remember if I said it a few minutes ago, is that we're going to have to see what the future brings, either further changes, new sets, other things that this could be future-proofing that, oh, well, there is going to be a mono-orange control deck that this fits into. Or there was a Orange X control deck that they didn't want this really being in anymore because it would have been ridiculous. We'll have to see. But for now, I'm okay with the Armageddon Angel change. I truly don't feel it was needed, but sure. So after Armageddon Angel and after Allfather's Horn, we come to Chort Stag, who is another card that is kind of been maligned, but I don't really feel like it was that bad. I thought it was strong. But I didn't think it was overwhelmingly so. However, you'll notice a pattern with the first 3 cards. I mean, Allfather's Horn is effectively a mythic because it banishes all other copies. You get 2 copies in your deck, but you only get to utilize 1. Armageddon Angel, mythic. Chort Stag, mythic. Noticing where this is going? So, anyway, Chort Stag is retaining its stats and cost, its gems. It loses Overrun. You still get to return a minion from your Boneyard to your hand, and it still cannot take more than 4 damage in combat. Losing the Overrun is actually pretty relevant. So this allows for games to be elongated, because a Chort Stag with Overrun means that you are just clobbering your opponent pretty quickly. For anybody who's not familiar, Overrun is trample. The excess damage that you're dealing to things go to the face, so that way you can't just chump block this thing. Well, now you can. Given that it produces multiple threats itself and then whatever it reanimates, plus it's very difficult to take down in combat on its own, this thing was a big, big threat. So this allows you to actually deal with the body and not have to have, okay, it hit turn 8, they drop this, they drop Iku-Turso next turn or the previous turn, and they follow it up with whatever they reanimated. And just, it's this constant stream of enormous threatening bodies that push you out of a game very quickly. So, I can understand it. I don't know that it was necessarily needed, but I think that this is... I can understand why this happened. I can respect this change. I don't really have a problem with it. And while I could have lived with it seeing, I'm not super married to the idea of the old Chort Stag. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Coming back to Chort Stag, as I was looking at chat, I'm okay with this. I don't really see a problem. So one thing that I didn't call out in the beginning is that from a design perspective, and hopefully I'll remember to put this as a separate thing and not just lump it into Chort Stag so people will see it separately in the timestamps on the video. Mostly I said that so I can remind myself when I'm editing it. See? Thinking ahead. When you talk about balance changes within a digital card game, even physical games, but obviously it's a little more challenging to errata a physical card, right? You can look at them as mini set releases. And the reason I'm saying that is, while we could infer a bunch of information about, oh, well, what's the future world they want to have? Both this meta that's going to be coming in when these changes go into effect and whenever hypothetical next set releases. What is that going to look like? What are their design goals? What do they not like? What do they think the community thinks? What does the community actually think? All this stuff. The other part is that you can look at these as mini set releases because plainly, after all these changes go in, the meta is going to be different. I highly doubt we're going to get the same builds with the same stuff. Things are absolutely going to be shaken up as people are experimenting and then ultimately finding that equilibrium to settle into. So if now green doesn't have this enormous mountain of just big dummies that will punch your face no matter what because of overrun, on top of generating card advantage, okay, well that means that green needs to lean into something else. They have now a greater weakness in these later game control decks, in these Dirtle decks, because they can't just bury you under this, all while providing a clock. And I think that there's a lot to infer from all of the changes, not just the ones we've talked about, but the future ones that we'll be getting into, about, well, what is the new world supposed to look like? And it's going to be very interesting to see what everybody comes up with community-wise. So, just throwing that out there, just quick thought. Well, speaking of green changes, we're going to talk about Circle of Protection. So, cost stays the same, persist stays the same, warded stays the same, but armor does not stay the same. We go from armor 2, we go down to armor 1. I'm being told by chat that a aggressive mono green aggro deck was showing up since the last patch. And to be honest, that's not too surprising because it seemed, from what chat's telling me, it just loaded up on K9, Spirit Burn, and Circle. And honestly, Circle felt like, I was going to say the worst kept secret, but it was... It felt like it didn't get the respect it deserves. Circle was absolutely busted, and possibly still is. I'm not sure. Getting a significant board, and when I say significant, it doesn't even necessarily have to be, oh, I filled every lane. Just getting a decent board and then playing Circle locks your opponent out of a huge amount of removal, or just simply trading. It required very specific responses, like corrode equipment, in order to actually deal with your threats. It allowed you to trade in combat effectively. It allowed you to dodge burn. It allowed you to do, tank, well, I guess that's trading in combat effectively, but tank other damage. And it lasted for a couple turns. So it was definitely very solid. It was very difficult to actually, you can't really interact with it for the most part. Once it's played, that is. This was really cool, and I really liked it when I was playing Green-Purple Spirit Burn. It was just super strong. So I'm not surprised that this got whacked somewhat. I'm almost surprised that it didn't get a further change, but I can appreciate, not stepping in and just crippling the card immediately. Like, stage it, iterative changes, and then see how things go. There's a lot of changes in this patch, and going too far for something like this could, like removing armor entirely, removing warded entirely, or something like that, could just turn the card into garbage. So I think it's worth addressing it this way. So after that, we have one more green change before we shift gears to something else. Another one that you can see sneaking up on the bottom that I'm sure many people are excited about. I'm personally not, but we'll get there. First, we got to talk about Deported. So Deported is the second half of another card. So you play first card, Detain specifically, then you get Deported. Goes from 2 cost and 2 green, ephemeral and bouncing a minion, to 3 cost and 2 green with the same card text. I'm being told by chat that this is the same thing, where it's targeting specifically that more aggressive deck. And I can get behind this change. It definitely felt like a huge tempo boost, we'll say. For aggro decks, it was a very clean answer, a relatively clean answer for control decks, so that way, if you're playing aggro, you can bounce their blocker, or their threat on the other side of the board, or whatever. And it was cheap enough that you could be like, oh, detain that thing, bounce that thing, go, in an aggro deck. You might have to jump through some hoops, but it can be done. And in a control deck, you could detain something, buy some time, deport something else next turn, or do it in the same turn. It built up charges on different artifacts, a variety of different things that you wanted. So it always felt like it was just a little too versatile. This, because of the specific spot in the curve that it hit, this is going to make it very challenging to squeeze in for other turns now, especially for those aggro decks, which, again, this chat is pointing out is where it's targeted at, or seemingly targeted at. The control decks can still manage to make this happen, but there will absolutely be turns where you go, oh, well, I could have deported that before, I can't now because I just don't have enough mana to do X and deported, or X, Y, and deported, that sort of thing. I think this is still a good change. I think this is worthwhile. If the aggressive decks have this sort of answer, I think it leads to a scenario where you run into problems eventually, no matter what. Because it's just so universal. You don't care how big it is. It's going to dodge most effects. Like, it doesn't care if the thing's warded. It doesn't care if, it can't take damage. It's like, all right, I bounce it and just gain a huge amount of tempo because that thing has to be replayed. So I can appreciate this change. I can get behind it. As to the general Mythgard stuff, until we get a new set, we get an inkling of what their idea, direction for the game is. But we don't know the whole story. And I think ultimately, this whole patch seems positive. We'll get to the final thoughts later on, but overall, I'm very positive about this patch, even if I disagree with some of the changes, because I think it's my personal preferences that make me not like it, and I'll explain with the next card, or not like parts of it, not like the whole patch as a whole. And I think that it's perfectly fine if you don't like the direction the game is going in. I don't think that it's a bad direction the game is going in. And I know I'm preaching to the choir with chat here. This is also for the sake of YouTube, but if you don't like something in the game, that's fine. You're allowed to not like it. The developers are also allowed to design it however they feel like it, and it may or may not be good. But it being good or bad is independent of whether you like it or not. You may like it because it's good. You may like it because it's bad. It depends on the scenario. I mean, I guess I could view it like this. New company, new vision, basically rebooted the game, so I could view this not as a balance patch, but as 1.0. In that sense, it seems less bad. I mean, yes, that is another valid way to interpret it, because we don't know from the outside looking in exactly how much influence the new overlords have. Are they just letting the design team run free? And this is something that, the shackles are off and the design team wanted to do this before? Or is it they're getting clamped down and the new overlords are coming in saying, no, this is how we want you to design your game, and you're going to do what we want? Or is it a more collaborative effort? Or some fourth option? I don't know. Like, it could even be a boat. we don't know, and we're just kind of guessing. I really think whenever the next set releases, we'll know a lot more. Like, that's when we're actually going to be able to tell, okay, what have they been cooking up? What do they actually want the game to move forward with? What is the next step along the path? And until then, we're just going to go with what we got, right? So next change that I was alluding to moments ago was Grand Finale. It was 8 cost. It's now 10 cost, and it also gets an additional gem. This is a card that people absolutely hated. Absolutely hated, because it was so powerful. You get an enormous cost discount on this. Now, you can... How do I put this? Because my argument was always, yes, you did need to make a quote-unquote sacrifice by including certain things in your deck. You did need to survive to turn 8 in order to grand finale and have it set up in the correct way. The problem I always had were the actual forge cards themselves. And I'm getting to a point here. Because for me, I would have said, change all the forge cards and then just be very, very careful about what future ones. And to be honest, I wasn't sure if we would ever get forge cards again. It could have just been, Magic is infamous for this. The WoW TCG was infamous for this. They introduced a brand new mechanic. It's like, oh, you can just almost build a deck with this. And then everything just vaporizes and you never see that mechanic for like another 6 years. It's like, oh yeah, remember that thing from 6 years ago? You could almost play it now. It's like, well, I could almost play it before. Why? But point is that there were a bunch of much more powerful forge cards that were created. And that's where it started to get weird, because I think what Grand Finale should be is you play it and it's like, okay, I stabilize. Now I can start the process of getting over the hump. Because I made this sacrifice, I get to do a cool thing, and then I take over the game. Not necessarily immediately, but in short order, because you had to have certain deck building constraints, you had to set up for this turn, blah, blah, blah. The way Grand Finale actually worked in practice most of the time, I assume most people would tell you, is that you just won when the Grand Finale happened because you end up getting like 35 mana worth of stuff, which is plainly bonkers. In the context of Mythgard, it didn't feel that bonkers to me, but I know a lot of people hated this card. I thought Grand Finale was already a fine finisher. You had to commit. I assume we're talking about green-red Finale, big green forge cards. Yeah, the green forge cards were one of the big problems. The red-orange Finale builds, I just don't think were as good. Like, the orange cards were just plainly not as good as Helicarrier. Spoiler alert. I can understand this change. Here's one of the reasons that I both understand and support this change. Technically speaking, only 24 mana worth of things max. Fair. I was exaggerating, but yes. So here's the thing. Why do I, even though I don't like this change, why do I like it? I know that sounds weird. Here's the reason why. Now more cool forge stuff can be printed. Because the baseline cost for this has increased on multiple fronts, both the actual mana cost and the gems. Now you can make cool forge things again. Previously, if you made more red or green forge stuff, the deck becomes even more bonkers, and you've passed this point of no return where it's, okay, everything's on this tipping point. This allows them, and you can see this with a lot of the nerfs that we've seen so far, it allows them to kind of reset things and give them more breathing room from a design and development perspective, where they can make these fun things and be like, okay, my Grand Finale is super cool again, even though I had to wait 2 more turns and put in more effort. I think that's acceptable. I think that's reasonable, and I can get behind this for that reason. I would need to see if 10 feels 2 turns too late now. Mythgard is a game of windmill slams, turn 10, really the new turn 8. Given that we've had some changes here, it's possible, but I agree with you, Tony. It's up in the air as to whether this is quote-unquote unplayable now, because while it still could fetch an enormous amount of mana and still way more than what you're putting into it, 2 turns is a long time, especially that late in the game. So we'll have to see. That's what it's going to come down to. People are going to have to try it. I actually think the best Finale decks were the green-red Reanimator decks that happen to have Finale. Well, yes, because that's what I had in mind when you were saying earlier, are we talking about green-red Finale? Because they allow you to attack on multiple fronts, get different usage out of your big fatties. It's like, oh, well, I'll pitch one, or one of them dies. All right, well, I'll Necromancer it back. Spoiler alert. Or, okay, you've dealt with all that? All right, Finale, I'll go get the other copies and windmill slam them into play. Oh, by the way, Chort Stag, pull something else back. Like, the redundancy of the effects was insane. Like, being able to fetch an improved version of 8 mana bomb for 8 mana feels like a fair play. Being able to fetch more than 8 mana worth of stuff is nuts. I think it's fine to go above, but there is an upper limit when you're talking about something like this, because it doesn't necessarily scale linearly, right, for the value that you're getting. So, yeah, I get it. That's why I was leaning more into, or here's the reason I was leaning more into nerf the Forge cards, not the finale, because of the previous context of where the game was. Now, again, I've been out of the game for a little while. Things have changed. Things are going to change with this patch. Well, I should be pointing that way, that patch. Things are going to change. So it's entirely possible that none of this is really valid, what I'm saying. But the way I was looking at it is if you nerf the Forge cards, just make what you're getting not so bad, I think that would have been okay. But I can appreciate the approach here. I think that's reasonable. Those decks were great tempo piles. They never felt like they were doing the most broken things, but they felt like they were doing broken things that had enough of the curve that forced you into an arc situation. I guess, yeah, in the general context, these decks weren't necessarily doing the most broken thing. I think that is, by definition, Allfather's Horn and Rainbow stuff. But they were still doing broken things. It still felt like you were cheating, which is, I guess you could describe a lot of things like that. But, all right, we'll move on from Grand Finale. After that, we have Harpy-One. So this was another card that I'm going to say right off the bat, I don't know that this needed to be changed, but I know that a lot of people hated this card. So it keeps its cost, keeps its stats, at least play cost, but it changes the cost for its transforming a minion into the original card. It also notably transforms another minion now, not itself. Previously, it's transformed a minion. Now it's transform another minion. This matters for things like when it has a ticking debuff or something else bad happens to it. You can't just reset it and keep it alive. Now it has to do it to other stuff, which is honestly probably more with its intended purpose. I get the sense that this thing was not necessarily intended to constantly keep itself alive and just shrug off any kind of negative effect that went its way. But it ultimately could do that. I think this is reasonable. This is a change that I don't know necessarily had to happen. But so far, if we look at all the things that have come up, these were all very played cards. These things showed up in a lot of decks. Maybe Circle didn't show up in quantity-wise a lot of decks, but the ones that wanted it absolutely wanted it. And Harpy is a staple probably still in any yellow deck. So this is, I think, acceptable. I don't really have a problem with this. I think it makes sense absolutely changing the self versus other. But I don't know about increasing the cost. I don't know if there was an issue with this. It seems a little weird. But ultimately, I'm good with this. Ultimately, I think this is fine. I can get behind this one. I don't have a problem with it. I think it goes basically into the idea of these are all top tier things. Let's bring them down a peg, give either this new set or just other things in the current meta time to breathe. Moving from there, we have Hopeless Necromantic. This is, again, on my personal list of things that had to change. I had a variety of different ways throughout my time playing Mythgard of things that I was considering, like, well, does this work? Does that work? How do we want to do this? What can we do? Ultimately, the route that the team went with is the new demise. No cost change, no gem change, no stat change. The new demise is Hopeless Necromantic is replaced by the bottom minion of your Boneyard that costs 5 or less. Give that minion Ephemeral. That's a big deal. That is a very big deal because now the decks that we were actually talking about earlier, those green-red finale decks, or the green-purple Reanimator decks, all those things where it was, oops, there's a perfect grade, oops, there's a Chort Stag, oops, there's a Helicarrier, oops, there's a Scylla, there's a whatever, there's this, there's that, and it's way earlier in the game than it should have been. Those just don't happen. Now, is this still relevant? Yeah, I mean, I played it in Spirit Aggro, and it was spectacular because it generates recurring spirits. It can reanimate other Necros still. You can still do things. But the decks that are going to utilize it are wildly different. Now, I can already hear the wailing and gnashing of teeth for a lot of people that were using Necromantic. But in every card game that I have played, I'm going to say I assume every card game, because there might be one that I'm thinking of that didn't do this, but every card game I played after Magic, really, really, really restricted reanimator strategies. I don't really necessarily have a problem. I like reanimator decks. It was one of the first things that I enjoyed when I played Magic way back when, literally using Animate Dead on things like, well, maybe not Lord of the Pit, but, you know, arbitrary big dummy. Maybe Lord of the Pit works sometimes, but not really. If you know, you know. But anyway, the idea is that cheating the mana curve is one of the most powerful things you can do in games because it's quote-unquote generating mana. It's drawing cards, generating mana. Those sort of things are almost always busted. And effectively, the Hopeless Necromantic, and it wasn't that hard to set up because of Disc and a number of other things, allows you to just cheat the game in a way that clearly the devs felt was unfair. Or at least enough people felt were unfair and probably told them about it. And I think this makes sense. Is 5 an appropriate number? I don't know. I'm going to have to check. But it seems reasonable. It seems reasonable. Honestly, I could have seen it as high as 7. Maybe, and then bump the cost up on certain things. Like, whatever you decide is, you have to be this tall to ride this ride and be considered a bomb. So you're this big, put Hopeless Necromantic below that level. And, okay, you can't reanimate the Iku-Tursos, the Chort Stags, the Scyllas, the whatevers, the big nasties that you don't want hitting the board that early. Realistically, I think that this change in Necromantic both makes sense, is reasonable, and I'm excited to see where it shows up. And again, like the other changes, it still gives them the option to make another Hopeless Necromantic that maybe even is the old one, just in a slightly different way, or opens up further design room so that they can just do other stuff. Whereas otherwise, similar to Finale, every time they print something, every time they print a minion, create a minion, they're going to have to go, well, what happens if this gets Necromantic back on, like, turn 4? Does the game just end? Because then that's going to be really dumb. Now it gives them a little more breathing room. I don't know what the cap should be, but if they're going to have one, it does have design implications. Like at 5, it's saying 5 costs can be below, can't do X. Exactly, Atona. That's kind of what I'm getting at with... I was coming at it from the other angle of saying, okay, you put it this high, and then, okay, the cool stuff happens up here. Everything else is just, you know, fairer minions. So it scales harder. Because then it's like, okay, you're fair, bang, you're nuts, sort of thing. I think in the near future, Necro could probably push 6. Bombs will generally push 7, 8, 9. That'll come down to what they do. I agree. 6 might be a weird spot because it's going to whiff on Necromantic, but then not be powerful enough to compete with the big boys. But that'll ultimately come down to the specific cards, right? Like what the text is. Necromantic's still good for Spirit Burn, still decent for Disc. Well, Disc is going to look very different, Doc. I agree about the former, and I did bring that up before you joined the stream, but Disc is going to look wildly different because you're not getting back perfect grades or the big green dummies or big red dummies or anything like that. It's going to be a different deck. Or the big blue ones. Like, you can't bring back that 12-12 thing, whatever the hell it was called. You're going to get smaller dummies who punch good, rather than big dummies who punch good. Next up, another green change is Iku-Turso. Still same cost, slightly smaller stat line. It also loses Overrun. So it goes from a 9-9 to an 8-8. It loses Overrun in favor of Regen 2. And the minion opposing it still has Defender and Immobile. This one's kind of weird. I get the stat reduction. That's probably just bringing things more into a baseline of what the new world is going to look like. So this is one of the changes that you could try and read into, like, what are they doing? What's going on in their head? What do they want the world of Mythgard to look like in the new world and in the future? The Overrun change, similar to Chort Stag, I get it. Probably elongates games, makes things less pointed, where it's, oh, well, my opponent snuck through a threat. I have to cleanly remove it off the board, or I lose in like 2 turns. Because that's not an unreasonable assumption when it's something this big. Now, the Regen 2 seems just somewhat random. I don't know. I guess it felt like if this was just an 8-8 for 8 with the Defender Immobile ability, it wasn't good enough, so they gave it something that isn't going to be overwhelming. Now, that being said, an 8-8 with regeneration means that it's not likely to die immediately, and now it's probably going to plow through like 3 minions, depending on what it is. It's supposed to hold a position on the board like Triassic Kraken. I don't know if you necessarily want to compare it to the Kraken. Like the Kraken, did anybody ever play that thing? I feel like I did at one point. It was just for memes, but I don't know. It's, I guess where I'm going with it, if the idea is to make it more like Kraken and less like it was, yes, it is, but I don't know if that's what we want. That's, I don't know about that one. Overrun feels more big green, though. I agree, but I also agree with the next comment that it seems like Overrun is not necessarily a green keyword, which is fine if that's the case. I'd have to go through the card pool and look at, well, how many actually green things still have, I lost my screen for a second. There we go. How many green things still have Overrun, and are they relevant things? I like the lore idea. This thing's enormous and it just plows through stuff, but okay. Volkov Heavy, Indrik Beast. Overkill, yeah. It's fine. So if you look at it from a design perspective, and I know, again, I'm preaching to the choir here with the chat, but for the sake of YouTube and other people that may not be as familiar, it's fine to have, okay, this is a core, we say Overrun is a core blue keyword now, assuming that it is. Maybe it won't be, but let's assume for the sake of argument that it is. It's fine to have some bleed into the other colors, that it shows up periodically. But then there will be other colors that just straight up won't have it because it doesn't make sense. And I think that's fine. I'm also fine if this thing had kept Overrun, but I understand, again, why this went away, because ultimately, if you are being forced to chump block this thing, getting clobbered and punished for even, like, desperately trying to stay alive, this change increases, similar to Chort Stag, the number of answers you can have. It doesn't literally have to be a removal card or a bounce card or something like that. It could just be, I'm going to stall the game out and try and push through that last set of damage. After that, we have Merciless Koxinga. This is another card, again, broken record time, but people hated this thing. So, what changes here? It keeps the same cost, keeps the same stat line, but it gets ability costs now. And now, instead of just being able to move an enchantment as a utility, it's one end utility. Instead of just being able to tag an artifact for 8 damage, it's 2 end utility to tag an artifact. You still get the Born in Cruelty for free. And I can get behind this. It definitely felt like Koxinga did just too much. It was like, okay, I got a 5/5 for 5. As soon as it comes out, bang, I'm doing whatever it is that I explicitly need in this matchup. I think forcing it to make an investment makes it a more reasonable card. Now, one thing that I sort of called attention to earlier with just mentioning that a lot of these cards are mythics that are changing. Yes, we had a common, we have the ephemeral common, we have an uncommon, and a rare that's a pseudo-mythic. We have a lot of mythics. Mythics previously in Mythgard held this, and the meme was Mythgard, because they held this unique place where you could only have one of them. So the way the game worked, you were likely to find it, assuming the game went on long enough, but you're only getting that one copy, again, barring shenanigans, like the old Necromantic. Point being is that this meant that they came out and they were hugely impactful. They immediately made their presence felt in basically all scenarios. Almost every mythic was just bonkers, which was fine. Oh, there is a change to Born in Cruelty. I'll mention that in a second. It's a very interesting change in philosophy that these mythics are getting nerfed and therefore obviously worse. They're still going to be very strong, but the gap has definitely closed between common, uncommon, rare, and where mythic was as compared to where it is now. Are they this close, or still like this? Can't even see my arms because they're out that wide. We'll see. But the change that was mentioned here was, the chat pointed out, and I'm glad you caught me on that, is that you only get one Born in Cruelty out of this, instead of being able to generate an hypothetically infinite amount, which was another issue. all of the changes drastically reduced the power level of this, but I think the flexibility of it before was just too much. I don't think a valid argument can be made that this thing was in the old context where everything was busted. Okay, I could see an argument. I think I've made that argument. Truthfully, I don't remember, but I never felt like, well, not never. There were times where I felt Koxinga was ridiculous, but it often didn't feel that way for me. Maybe because I wasn't necessarily playing artifact decks a lot or things like that. But yeah, it did a lot. This is a lot of things, and this is just kind of reining it in. Koxinga was kind of necessary, though, because purple lacked utility in a lot of ways. I think Koxinga nerf is probably too much. It might be. I think the Born in Cruelty thing probably makes the most sense, but this is also from a flavor perspective. Should purple be able to move and deal with enchantments? Because moving it out of a relevant lane is almost as good as eliminating it. Dealing with artifacts, I think, and I mentioned this many times before, but artifacts probably just need a general change, which we didn't see in this patch, really. The Born in Cruelty thing felt a little ridiculous. That having infinite Born in Cruelties. There were games where I, no joke, had a hand of like 7 Born in Cruelties. Did it matter then? Sometimes. Sometimes it was just for the sake of it, but I like the idea that mythics could be synergy pieces or completely unique effects rather than generically good cards. That makes sense, and I like that approach better. In general, like in the abstract. Is it better for Mythgard? That's up for debate, I think. Koxinga is a fair stated minion that once per turn allows purple to do something it otherwise couldn't. I mean, that's still true. You can still do it. You just can't. You're paying a penalty because you can't normally do it. Which is, I think, reasonable. I think they went too far on this one. Or way too far on this one. I could see it. I could see it. Like I said, on one hand, Koxinga felt like it just does a ton of stuff. On the other hand, it's like, I don't know, was it actually too much stuff? It's also, again, this could be future-proofing. I guess the question is, are people really going to cut Koxinga from decks? I don't think so. Now, I could be wrong. I haven't played in a while, but I doubt people are going to go, this card's terrible, I'm not playing it anymore. Koxinga was busted in the same way that Oak was busted. Not busted in one thing, but strong in a lot of different directions. I do think it's slightly over-nerfed, though. That's fair. That's fair. I think that's a reasonable take. There's a quest that rewards you for... Oh, that's something else. What if it's just one cross across the board on his ability without the once per turn thing? I'm surprised they didn't go with allowing multiple on the last ability in some way. I'm honestly kind of surprised. I'm of two minds about this ultimately, as you can kind of tell by my waffling back and forth, that in some instances it feels justified because it did so many things. It did things outside of the color pie for purple. It provided so much utility, but at the same time, it's like, okay, it's just a 5 for 5 that in some matchups, it's like, okay, it gives you a pseudo removal card. It doesn't even necessarily remove something unless you're running Erode. Which, honestly, maybe that's why they're worried about it, so that it's a different way to nerf Erode. It's a different way to address some other parts of the game. Because remember, not everything about this is in a vacuum, and it's all about Koxinga itself. It's going to be about other cards, other effects, ones that exist or ones that don't exist. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of ways they could have gone with this. I'd love, and unfortunately we don't get in these patch notes any information as to why some of these things happen, other than the blurb at the beginning. No, like, well, we changed Koxinga because specifically A, B, and C. Because I think that would help. Can't necessarily blame them, because communities across the gaming world are not known for taking things well or necessarily allowing the devs to speak, we'll put it that way. We're going to have to live with this one regardless. Of all the changes so far, I think I can safely say this is the one I disagree with the most. Do I disagree with it a ton? If I'm playing purple, I'm still playing this, I think. It just changes how you're going to have to utilize it. Which I think if we got this original, or this new Koxinga, instead of, like, we never saw the old one, I think most people would still consider this very strong. It gives you a removal card for free. You don't have to do anything, jump through any hoops for it. And then it gives you 2 abilities outside of your faction's normal, realm of influence in relatively unique ways. Mostly moving the enchantment. The dealing 8 damage directly is kind of whatever, but it does provide something that you can't necessarily get in a ton of effects. So, it still seems pretty strong. We'll have to see how it shakes out. I'm very curious. Like, this one, I'm the most waffly on, I guess. So speaking of Oak, because chat was bringing it up, we also have a nerf to Oak. Same cost and gems, same stat line, still immobile. It still has when one of your other minions dies, your opponent takes 1 damage and you gain 1 life. But the demise has changed. And it's was Divination 3, draw a card. Now it's just Divination 3. Oak, I don't know. Compared to the things that preceded it on this list, I think most of these even the ones that I disagreed with or had questions about, I don't know. Oak added this air of inevitability in some matchups. But I don't know. I honestly would rather have lost the divination than the draw. I really would have rather lost the divination than the draw. The replacing itself, I think, was kind of a big deal. Obviously, divination into draw means, you get some influence on what you're getting. But is this going to stop? Like, are people going to not play this? I imagine you're still going to play it. Aggro decks still want this because it adds additional reach. The divination is still relevant, even if it's not quite as strong as before. If something had to get changed to this, I guess that is what was going to go, other than ripping off the divination. Apparently it was nerfed exactly because it was replacing itself. That's what it seems like. That's what it seems like. Reduces the amount of red, oops, I draw a card. Yes. Which notably, Iker is not on here. But, yeah, reducing red draw, because red has been a faction for a long time that people have complained about because it has everything. It has burn, it has aggro, it has control elements, it has board fills, it has board clears, it has grand finale, it has this, it has that, it has all these things. It does a lot of things. And pulling back on some of those effects leaves the whole healthier, like pruning some of these things, because it means, again, that you have room to play around with other ideas. It matters. It matters. Ichor Feast is a deliberate draw, though. You play Ichor Feast just to draw. Yes, but the redundancy... So one of the things that I've mentioned on many occasions for a lot of games, actually, but Mythgard too, is that I don't feel aggro was in a very healthy spot, and I think a lot of people overrated things like mono-red aggro. Especially in the context of how powerful some of the more generic control decks like white, yellow, green can be. And were. Possibly still are. And maybe still will be. Point being is that you could suppress mono-red. Yes, mono-red will oops, I win sometimes, because aggro can do that. But there were plenty of times where it's just, you get smothered by yellow-green, and the only reason that you're even remotely in the game is because of Ichor Feast and because of the incidental draw from things like Oak. Or Oak digging for specific things like, all right, well, I can go find wings. I can go find Daring Trapezes. I had to think for a second what it was called. I could go find whatever to close the game out. Or go find Ichor Feast, draw some cards. Point is that you had these effects. Now that they're gone, we'll have to see how it plays out. It's fine, like I said, pruning some of these things so that overall You have a better base to work from, a healthier base. Like, okay, this is the baseline that we assume, and now we know what we're adding on, because things maybe got convoluted before. But I think this is going to hurt a lot. I don't think people are going to stop playing it, but I think this hurts more than it might seem on the surface. I like that red was aggro with a stream of cards. A lot of red cards are fairly understated and relies on oops draws. Red aggro without oops draws is just worse than other aggro. That's kind of the position I'm in, Atona. Honestly, like, I feel that red aggro needed that constant stream because otherwise they just get bodied constantly. Their stuff gets removed just by looking at it funny. You can block their stuff in a lot of cases reasonably. Yes, there were combat tricks and things to change that, but we'll have to see. Is it dead? Well, there's too many changes here to say that. There's too many changes to say that something's 100% dead. But this does hurt. I think it does. I think the thing about Oak is that if you burned 4 red, you played it. So basically, if you played red, you played Oak, aggro, mid-range, and control. Now, that's a good point to bring up and worth talking about. It's worth talking about. I have zero problem with that. If literally every deck list that was yellow-green, mono-red, mono-blue, green-blue, like, pick any combination of colors. If they were literally identical, I have zero problem with that. Yeah, it's nice every once in a while to go, oh, I'm watching a game. Oh my God, that's such a cool tech. Most of the time, I don't care. I really don't. And playing the cool tech is way more frustrating than anything else. Because it's like, why are you playing that card? Because, especially on ladder, you get blown out by something dumb. And it's like, you're going to lose in every other matchup. But because I'm playing something, I'm the only deck you beat with that card. And it's not even necessarily good there. That's what happened a lot. I don't have a problem with that. However, that's me. And I absolutely understand that most people don't feel that way. They want the diverse meta. They want this variety of cards and decks and strategies. I'm currently playing games that literally everyone has access to all the same, well, for the most part, in a perfect world because they're collection challenges. But if everybody had full collections, everybody has access to every card at all times. 100%. And I like it. It's like chess. You know, you get your pieces. As opposed to, well, you get bishops and I get rooks. I get one knight, but you get a queen and I get an extra thing. Like, you know, I'm trying to make this analogy work, but it gets weird. Point is that I would be fine if the cards were just, or the decks were just what they were. However, the game is not trying to cater to me. So I get it. Just putting that out there. Mono Red Journey was value city. Die, draw, comes back, draw again. Yeah. Mono Red was a solid budget option, but I don't feel it was overpowered. Relied on oopsie consistency that actually makes it harder to jump in. Mythgard is a game of sideboard cards with no sideboard. It's actually really weird. It's like they designed the game from the ground up for a different structure. To a degree. I think the assumption was that a lot of things, such as Koxinga, were going to have... this was your one-of way to main deck a sideboard card, sort of thing. Next one is another one that people were absolutely shrieking about, and honestly, I can't blame them too much. I disagree, but we're getting a lot of nerfs, a lot of changes, so I'm fine with this one also getting changed. So we keep the cost, we keep the durability, we actually increase energy from 2 to 3. Why? Because we're increasing the cost on Orbital Jamming Satellite from 2 to 3. So this makes sense. It was a super powerful ability. You immediately get to suppress something, take away all their abilities, and usually that meant that thing's immediately dead, depending on what it was. You know, you usually engineer these scenarios. The yellow-green artifact decks or any yellow deck that's controlling probably tried to feature one of these so that you could set up these scenarios. It's an incredibly powerful ability, but now the big thing is instead of, you know, every 2 turns, you're doing it every 3. That's exactly it, Tony. You get to do it on the initial play. The concern, presumably from the devs, was that you can consistently, or more consistently in the old version, deactivate your opponent's stuff. Now you're not going to be able to do it as consistently. Your opponent gets to play with their cards more than they did before, because we've all had those games where you're playing against an artifact-based deck, and then all of a sudden they play the satellite, it's exposed for a turn, and then bang. It's like 2 of those 1-cost green things that I can't think of the name of that draw cards when you play spells. That's suddenly protected, and you're never going to kill it. You're just never going to kill it. Worth noting, Koxinga doesn't kill satellite on activation. Yes, but it didn't before, right? It didn't get a nerf to the damage. No, it didn't get a nerf to the damage, so it wasn't going to do it before. I'm fine with this. Like I said, in the context of the way things were versus the way they're going to be now, I think this makes sense. It's another card that people are absolutely screeching about. And again, I can understand the argument. If Satellite is too weak, it could have its starting energy increased to 4. Yeah, for all of these changes, if it turns out that they over-nerfed it, they could always revert it. They could do another change. It could be anything. It could even be a boat. But yeah, making it take longer to charge up absolutely is going to impact things, and across multiple turns. It's arguably a stronger nerf than it is just by increasing the cost to anything, including this, by 1. Because that's a one-time cost that you're paying. This means that your second, your third, your fourth suppression, those don't happen necessarily. They may not happen at all, but they certainly happen later. And that means your opponent, again, gets to play with their cards more often. One of the most frustrating things when you play a game, and if you're a MOBA player out there, stuns are one of the more frustrating things for a lot of people, because you literally don't get to play the game. And there are other variations of it across other genres and types of games. And suppressing your opponent suppressing your stuff feels bad, and I get it. So ultimately, I think that this is fine. I can get behind this. I think this is pretty solid. I don't see necessarily a big problem with doing this, is the point. After that, we're moving into purple stuff again. We have the perfect grade nerf. It's getting a stat nerf, a cost nerf, and an energy start nerf. I'm trying to catch what else was there. I think all the abilities are the same. I'm just looking at it real quick to make sure, because I missed the energy the first time I looked at this offline. So, it goes from 8 to 9. It goes from 6/7 to 6/6. And it also gets an energy nerf. This feels extreme. If we're talking about Koxinga before, this feels extreme. Don't get me wrong, this card was really, really strong. This thing was really, really strong. Being able to come out and do, ability 1 and then ability 2 to effectively clear a board almost independent of where it was insane. Then you get this big body with armor, and then the recurring energy abilities. I think this is very relevant. This also, similar to the satellite change, means that it's not necessarily going to get back to the point where it can do this stuff, because it's already starting out lower. So it regenerating the energy means it's not just going to get back into the ability. Like, you can still A1, we'll call it, ability 1. But you can't necessarily get up. You're missing that energy. I know it seems obvious, and I'm calling more attention to something that's super obvious, but it matters. It matters a lot. I don't necessarily agree that it was too slow in a lot of games. Was it too slow in games? Yes. Was it bad? No. Is it now? Maybe. I don't really like this one. I'm not sure that it needed all of this. Honestly, if you went from 8 to 9, but kept all the other stuff the same, that might have been sufficient, because a whole turn in Mythgard can be an eternity. Just trying to combat everything that happens. And I know we were talking about how there were a lot of Dirtle decks, and there's a lot of control decks and things that drag things out. But it's not necessarily the length of the game, it's just the tempo of the game. And now you can't do this and other stuff as easily. You can't just get it on the board as easily. And remember, you're not going to be reanimating it with Necro. We're just stat nerfing it and keeping it at 8. I don't know that this stat nerf is really all that significant. That's one of my favorite cards, Scrungle. That card is hilarious. Just wait until you play it. Nobody spoils Scrungle on that. Nobody spoils Scrungle. Play that card, Scrungle, and report back to us. Just trust me. Trust me. For anybody out there wondering, we're talking about Stab Crab. Nobody spoil him. I think it's slower in a lot of matches, and every match was already too slow. It's still too slow, and the game ends before turn 9 is also too slow. I don't know. I don't know if I can 100% agree with that. I hear what you're saying, Atona. I hear what you're saying. Or I see what you're saying. I don't know that the stat nerf matters outside of corrode equipment. Corrode equipment is relevant because now it just kills it in 2 volleys instead of having to get that third one. Stab Crab is the best flavor text, which is surprising because this game has a lot of strong flavor text. It does. The game, there's so many things I love about Mythgard. It's great. Misanthropia, yes, also true. There's a few things, but I don't think that that's significant enough of a nerf. I'm not sure what's being targeted here. Like, what is... So the stat nerf deals with yellow removal, right? That lets it die in 2 turns instead of 3. Okay. The energy nerf means it's a little worse against wide boards, because unless they clumped everything, you can't necessarily nuke things. The cost nerf means that it also helps aggro because it's coming out later. It makes your control mirror is a little clunkier. Does it need all of them? I don't know. I don't know. It feels a little heavy-handed, but we'll see. Now it dies to an Iku. Iku... So Iku's an 8-8 now. Iku's an 8-8. So yes, it will die to an Iku. It would have died to an Iku before because Iku was 9. So that didn't change. And maybe that's part of it. You know, the stat nerf and the energy nerf, the cost nerf is to open up space for other things around its cost. Makes sense. Yeah, it feels pretty heavy on this. This is one, compared to some of the other cards where even the preceding card, where I know people were screeching about certain changes and just demanding them for a long time. I don't know how many people are asking for this, but I could absolutely see it opening up additional space. But it's one of those things that the card still does a lot. It's still pretty powerful. I'm willing to give it a try. But the world does change because the Necro nerf and other things. So this is going to be very different. Very different Perfect Raid. After Perfect Raid, we have Plague Maidens, who gets a whole lot of changes. Well, maybe not a ton of quantity-wise, but very significant ones. Loses Lurker, loses Demise, and gains an attack. So I guess maybe quantity-wise, comparatively, it is a lot of changes. This is one that I think absolutely had to happen in some way, shape, or form. Changes to Plague Maidens specifically. Did these specific changes have to happen? Maybe. There's a variety of different ways that I could see it being shifted around, but ultimately, I'm not entirely sure. Similar to Perfect Raid, you have to look at it from multiple angles. The Lurker meant that it basically never died. Like, your opponent, unless they were desperate or didn't care, was not going to let this die if it was relevant. And it basically was always relevant, giving blight to things. Even in control matchups, it would help whittle things down to an appropriate size. The Demise allowed for weird things to happen, especially in like yellow-green artifact decks with Media Autocam, the artifact that I couldn't think of just a few minutes ago. Gives you an extra spell. Troikasect had a lot of value against a variety of different things. Since we're getting nerfs on other stuff, I could see, you know, having Troikasect now further nerfing some of those archetypes if it was so prominent. Now it clearly won't be. It's still going to serve as an early game answer to other aggressive decks, like the mono reds of the world. But they can actually deal with it now. Like, they could run a rush minion in. They could, you know, if it is forced to block something, it can't just stand in front and go, oops, I'll block if. If it does block, you're not getting a Troikasect on top of it to further bury your aggressive opponent. That's fair. That's fair. Also got a card called Doper. I guess those babies are 100% natural. Oh, you'll love that. That's one of my favorite cards in the game, Scrungle. Like, that might actually be my favorite card. Troika could see play in certain lists. It's nearly a removal against a lot of small bodies. I agree, and that's why Troika being attached to an already removal-based body feels like it was overboard. This is something that I'm personally very happy about because I think that aggro was in a rough spot on a variety of fronts, and clearly this is helpful for aggro decks, but it still is a functional card. So I think I'm comfortable with this. I'm willing to try it out, similar to the other ones. Am I going to cut it from green-yellow lists? Possibly, but I could still see it being relevant, especially depending on the meta. More yellow stuff. We're actually moving into yellow stuff from yellow-green. We have Sapo. Sapo is getting a nerf to its cost, going from 7 to 9. The text is, I think, different. Destroy an enemy minion in the opposite lane and friendly minions adjacent to this. Gets +2/+2 for each minion destroyed this way. Why does this look different? Destroy an enemy minion in the opposite lane and friendly minions in adjacent lanes. Gets +2/+2 for each minion destroyed this way. Okay, then I'm not imagining things. All right, chat's confirming that it's just the spacing change. Because I'm looking at them like, those two sets of text do not line up. Why? What is different about this? Okay, that makes sense. So the ability's staying the same, but we are getting a cost increase. Now, Sapo was one of the ones that I vehemently disagreed with the community about, where I always felt Sapo was fine. And kind of everything should have, like, if we pin Sapo as the ideal mythic power level, everything else should be, in line with that. Am I going to lose a lot of sleep over Sapo going 7 to 9? No, absolutely not. I think it might push this out of, down the line, it might push it out of auto staple range. Like other yellow mythics or other just yellow cards come in and displace Sapo, because while it is a big threat, it's a tanky threat, both from a size perspective and warded. It's card advantage kind of inherently because it's removing stuff. You just don't have to make sure you don't eat your own unless you want to. I think that I don't know, this one feels like it hurts for Sapo. Like I said, I thought Sapo was fine before. I think it was completely reasonable. I think going to 8, I could see jumping 2, as we were talking about with other cards. Yeah. Whew. 2 turns is like an eternity. It's tough. It's tough, but I'm willing to give it a shot. Like I said, the community as a whole, obviously not every person, but many people were complaining about Sapo. It definitely feels bad because removal always hurts, especially when your opponent eats your guy and then they get a huge guy that has warded, and on top of it, Sapo gets bigger. Like, that's a lot of stuff. I don't know. I don't have much more to say about it. I feel like it would have been fine if it stayed. I'm okay with the change, though. I'm not going to... Whatever. It's okay. I don't think anybody's really going to be too upset over it. Next is Sea Lord's Trident. This is one that I think needed to be changed and maybe wasn't on a ton of people's radars. People being community-wise. So, same durability, same cost, same gem cost. It previously was pay 2, create a 4/2 Fel Kraken if you don't already have one. Now it's pay 2 and lose 3 durability, create a 4/2 Fel Kraken if you don't already control one. Trident had... You thought Trident was fine? I don't know about that one. The scenarios where Trident was busted were just absurd. Yes, there were scenarios where Trident came out and it was just somewhat mediocre, but you had the absurd decks where it was just, okay, I'm going to fling these things at your face until you die sort of decks. It also could get buried under a bunch of artifacts, and then your opponent is forever creating these Krakens that you just can never fully address because you'll never get at the Trident. I think it's absolutely reasonable to say, hey, you can have your Trident, but you don't get it forever. Yep, I remember that, Doc. The first time I played Trident and you stole it. I just got the card and I'm like, oh, I can't wait to try this out. And then he steals it. What a jerk. What a jerk. I don't know. I think this is fine, this change. If you look at it, at 3 durability, I don't know actually if... So you go down to 1 durability. I presume it'll still let you create the 4th body. Is 3 durability too much? That might be the case. 3 might be a lot. I'm fine with it losing durability. I don't know that it needs to be 3. Even if it was literally 1 durability, so that way, I mean, 10 is still a lot. Maybe 2 would be better. 3 feels like a bit much. But I think losing durability, doing something so that the Trident doesn't sit there forever and perpetually summon this. Maybe 2, but 3 seems fair. I think 3 might be on the high side. 1 is probably too low, but something had to be done. I don't think Sea Lord's Trident was okay in its original form. I think that even in the old world, probably would have been an issue, or was an issue, and it would definitely be an issue now, I think. The question is what was this addressing? And if it was the infinite combo decks, as in, you know, you get your ringleader or whatever gave them rush, and then you're just face, or clear the board, and then face. Yeah, sure, it deals with those. Because they can't do this a billion times. Yes, you could repair the durability in certain ways, but it's not necessarily going to work out. I just 100-0 you. I don't like the idea that artifacts are getting pigeonholed into artifact path decks. I actually really like that, truthfully. I think artifacts as a whole are a problematic mechanic. And I felt that way for a long time. So if we assume that artifacts are not going to get like an enormous overhaul, you know, they're not going to completely change the way artifacts work. Like all artifacts take durability damage when you get damaged, or they just all die after a certain number of turns, or, you know, something drastic. If we're not going to go that route, which it doesn't seem like we're going to, then I think locking them so that they are only really feasible in certain decks allows the dev team to more appropriately control them. There will surely, like, mono red aggro could still run this, and I don't think it's ridiculous. If you have the room, like, if Sea Lord's Trident was good enough for mono red aggro before, it probably is still good enough now. The game was going to end long before you would get the 5th Kraken out there. So, ultimately, I don't think this is problematic, or pushing, the idea of pushing enchantments into enchantment decks or artifacts into artifact decks is problematic. It reduces the scope that something dumb can happen outside of that. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. Discovering that cool thing is fun until that cool thing becomes the regular everyday thing and then people are sick of it, or it becomes problematic. And in both those scenarios, it allows for maybe producing the cool without having the problematic because it's confined within this certain box. If you're winning after spending 7 on a pair of 4/2s, you probably have 1 with an Ichor Feast or whatever. Yes and no, because you can... I mean, if you had Ichor Feast, but the thing is that this gives you free, like, it gives you virtual card advantage by producing the bodies. I think it's still a completely reasonable card to run in outside of artifact decks. Because you're getting a cost-efficient body that you don't have to invest cards for, so that means you could either burn, you could play them, you could do whatever. Like, this is still fine. I don't really have a problem with this, and I think that this is a reasonable change, with the exception maybe the durability. Both the cost and the durability itself maybe could be different. Moving on from there, another red change. We go from 7-ring ritual to brand new 7-ring ritual, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, shocker, 7 red gems required. 7 red gems required. I never had a problem with 7 Ring Ritual, but I know people hated this card. It constantly felt that 7 Ring Ritual was a card that you had to respect, of course, because it could end the game in short order if your opponent ritualed and then you went, whoops, I already burned all my sweepers. But you're playing against a red deck, you knew they were going to run it. Play around 7 Ring Ritual, and I think that that positively impacted the way games played out. Now this is effectively locked to... This is locked to mono red. I don't see how you could possibly run this in other things. I mean, I take that back. There are games where this will happen. But realistically, you probably shouldn't have this card in your deck if you're running multicolor. Certainly not triple color, because like that's just not going to happen unless we get a new card, right? Like card that changes the way gems work or something. As it stands right now, you could play it in a slower red-purple, possibly. Red-heavy, red-purple. Well, yes, you better be red-heavy. This is weird. This is weird. I don't know. I honestly felt 7 Ring Ritual was fine before. I almost was verging on it wasn't great. It had enormous upside if you got it to work, but it was just almost impossible to get it to work. Even in the scenario that your opponent didn't immediately clear the board with a sweeper because, you know, you had to telegraph the 7 Ring Ritual 100 miles away. They could just 1-for-1 a bunch of stuff, and then it's like, okay, you have a couple of 3-1s. I'll tank it. It is what it is. Ritual is pretty good. I don't know if it was really good, given the context of other things. I legitimately think it was fine before. Like, that's something I'll disagree with people on. And it's fine if people feel it wasn't. I legitimately did not have a problem with 7 Ring Ritual. Certainly not in the way I had problems with things like Allfather's Horn. Or Hopeless Necromantic. Or even Grand Finale. I don't know that there are very few cards on this list that I would have said needed a change less than 7 Ring Ritual. There are tons more that needed changes before 7 Ring Ritual, I think, that are on this list, I mean. At the end of the day, am I all that broken up over it? No. Again, a lot of people hated this card. A lot of people felt it was too strong. This is fine. 7 Ring Ritual isn't any weaker, it's just being restricted to less dippable. So the card is not weaker, but the archetypes are weaker. And that is, again, another kick in the junk to, say, green-red. Obviously red-purple, too. Because you're going to have to jump through hoops to make this happen. You're going to have to earn it more to make this happen. We'll have to see where this plays out. I don't expect it's no longer default any red deck bomb. Yes, that's absolutely true. But I don't think that it was a problem as in any red deck bomb. Again, this was something I mentioned earlier, but I have zero problem with things showing up in literally every deck. Now, this does, positive-wise, open up, again, similar to other changes, design space where, okay, we can now make you, as the player, the deck builder, decide, do I want 7 Ring Ritual or do I want this other cool thing? Because guess what? You're not going to have 7 Ring Ritual and the new Armageddon Angel in the same deck. You're not playing them both. I mean, I guess you could put them in the same deck and then try and make it happen depending on the matchup. But that sounds like it's verging on insanity. So, is this a positive change? Yes, I think there are absolutely positive aspects of this change. I think it opens up more design space. It satiates people that were, salivating for this to get nerfed. It alleviates some of the deck constraints. It allows for, some different gameplay patterns. Do I think it actually had to happen? Probably not. I would have been perfectly fine with the original 7 Ring Ritual or nerfing it slightly less. It does still fit that it's, you fill 7 lanes, it costs 7 gems. I get it. It's clean. It's nice. But I don't know. Play 3 Seal of Exiles, remove 3 orange gems, so you can get the 3 or 7 red gems. That is one way to do it. I forgot about Seal of Exile, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, I see we got multiple people in chat on the same page with that. Yeah, honestly, I didn't have a problem with the old 7 ring ritual. In the new world, I could see it getting nerfed. Does it need to get nerfed this bad? I don't think so. But, okay. I'm not going to agree with all of them. I get this. I get it. And I like in the abstract, but on paper, this change makes sense, and I agree with it. I just personally don't like it because I don't think this card necessarily needed it. Next up is another similar change, and that is Traitorous Murmur. So we've had nerfs to this in the past. It's going from 3 gems to 6 gems, keeping the same text. I think this makes sense. In the same vein that we saw these iconic cards, 7 Ring Ritual, your Armageddon Angels, Perfect Ray got a nerf, but not by gems. Allfather's Horn, these hugely impactful cards are now effectively getting restricted to monocolor decks. Now, to that end, Murmur isn't necessarily required to be in a monocolor deck. You can absolutely run this in still yellow-green. It's just you have to jump through more hoops in order to make it happen. If you want to play it on turn 7, you're going to have to burn 6 green gems. That's asking a lot. This is actually, I think, pretty solid. I think forcing these powerful effects, again, restricting them, I know it's broken record, but confining them to these boxes where they can be more easily controlled, that we'll get, honestly, I kind of expect that we'll get a nerfed Murmur, like a weaker Murmur, we'll say, as a new card in the future. Similarly, we'll probably get a 3-ring ritual, 5-ring ritual in the future, a smaller Armageddon Angel, like a localized where it's only certain lanes or something like that. I think that there's a lot of things that are opened up by this. So I can absolutely appreciate this. It's also another card that is super frustrating. If we were talking like what would be just a smaller nerf, you could go more cost increase. But I think that given what we've seen, there's absolutely a theme running throughout all these changes about where these cards are supposed to be, air quotes. So, yeah, I think this makes sense, especially within the context of the whole patch. With the whole patch, especially now that we're getting to the bottom of the changes, you can see the theme that's commonly run throughout a lot of the changes, and I can get behind this. I don't really see a problem with this one. Next up is another one that absolutely was on my personal list. We mentioned this briefly earlier. And that's Ved'ma Helicarrier. So it keeps the same cost, keeps the same stats, but it loses teleport. A little weird, but we'll talk about that in a second. The Awaken changes. Instead of getting 6 pack troopers, you only get 3. And then the activated ability changes. Instead of adding 2, you now get 3. And it reduces the cost of your soldier minions by 1 until sundown because it loses the Forge. So now you can't even get this with Grand Finale. Briefly bringing back up the Grand Finale change, still okay from the idea that you are opening up future Forge minions. So now you just can't fetch this thing. It also can't be Necromantic back. Also huge. Honestly, with those other changes, maybe this didn't need to get nerfed. But let's assume for the sake of argument that it can. Teleport, truthfully, didn't come into play all that often. It really didn't matter all that often when I was playing this. But it did come up. All right, fine, it loses it. Whatever. I don't think anybody's going to lose sleep over that. Way less pack troopers and things. That's a little more significant, especially because you can't get it into play with Forge so that you can immediately play it and then just crap out a bunch of pack troopers. This is pretty significant. But is the card still playable? It's still a value engine. It's still an enormous value engine because it's generating all this virtual card advantage. Since you can't cheat it out, no Grand Finale, no Necromantic, this one I'm going to have to see. My gut feeling is it's still good. Is it good enough, or are other things going to displace it? Maybe? I don't know. This one's weird. I'm very happy that it got changed, but it also is one of the coolest cards. I love the idea of these helicarriers, these big, cool constructs. You know, you have your battle cruisers, but they were causing problems, specifically this one. So, I'm absolutely behind changing this. These specific changes, especially in the context of the other two nerfs, Finale and Necromantic. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. Wry Trickster, same cost, same stats. Demise stays the same, but the ability changes a little bit. Instead of getting -2, -0, and Fragile 2, now it's -1, -0, and still Fragile 2. Now, it also... So let's read the actual ability together. Select an enemy minion without revealing it. If it attacks before your next sunrise, beginning of your turn, it gets the debuffs. As opposed to before, this seems like it's going to work the same way. It's just rewording how it's... Like, this just seems like a rewording. Unless I'm misunderstanding. Because previously it was select an enemy minion without revealing it. It gets before attacking -2, -0, and Fragile 2 until sunrise. It's just a cleaner reword. Okay, yeah. It seems like it's just rewording, and I just want to double check. So, in this case, the main thing is that it goes from -2 to -1. I don't know. I really don't like Wry Trickster because I feel like it's one of those cards that can just absolutely change a matchup on its own. And yes, the answer is okay, well, it's 2 health, just kill it if you're an aggro deck. Well, that's easier said than done in a lot of scenarios. And the fact that it can protect itself. It can't protect itself as easily, but it still can. Still has the Fragile 2, which is relevant for larger threats that you tag with it. Oh, it also gets a gem cost increase. Okay, so that's pretty relevant. Because that means it's not necessarily just accidentally getting dropped on turn 2. So you're playing an aggro deck, you go threat pass. They go row pass. You go threat pass. They can't necessarily go Wry Trickster. It also is going to have to require a commitment to double orange early on, which is not necessarily what you want, depending on what you're building. So I'm getting behind this. I'm warming up to this. I almost feel like one more minor thing could have been done to it. Like, maybe this wouldn't be minor, but like either remove the entire debuff or remove the fragile, but you can't remove the debuff because then it's just like... I guess this is all you could do. This is all you could do without, like, really crippling the card. Without truly crippling it. I'm willing to try this out because Wry Trickster was definitely a thorn in my side. I mentioned multiple times throughout this that I'm not a fan of the way aggro, or the status aggro was in. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. Deeply dislike the -2, -0. Yeah, this is definitely better. Is it enough? We'll see. I mean, things can still attack for the most part. There aren't many, one attack minions that were getting run. So whatever it is, those 2-1s that were, or 2Xs that were getting run, they'll still be able to attack. We'll have to see. So the last thing here down in the fine print down here is that some puzzle changes are happening because, well, as you'd imagine, cards that got changed, the puzzles either don't work or need an update because of that. So makes sense. However, for overall patch thoughts, the one-sentence answer is I like this patch. I actually like it a lot. I think there's a lot of positive changes for the game, even if I don't necessarily agree with any of the specific changes, or not, let me rephrase that. Even if I don't agree with all of the specific changes, I think that there's a lot of positive things that happen here, and I think that it makes sense to do it. I think that it's worthwhile, and I think that the game will be in a better position given this. It will absolutely be in a different position, because no matter what, there are archetypes that absolutely got changed, that absolutely either were kneecapped or now this thing that was hanging on the periphery can all of a sudden get lifted up because, oh, well, the biggest predator for it now is gone. Looking at you, green, red, if you were holding things down, guess what? You're going to have to change because these finale builds are definitely going to look different. These necromantic decks are going to look different. I mean, there are some hits here and there to mono red aggro, but overall, this hits a lot of the pain points that the community has been talking about. It attacks it in unique ways that I think are going to be beneficial in the grand scheme, that you're going to be able to lock things down to specific decks, that it frees up room, as I mentioned many times, in the design space to do stuff. It's going to be interesting because the world is absolutely different before this patch and after this patch. As I mentioned before, this is effectively a set release. Because what happens on a set release? Yes, you get new toys. We're not getting anything new, technically. We are kind of getting new cards, but we're not technically getting net new cards. Instead, we're getting a massive meta shift, or should be a massive meta shift. I just don't see how Mythgard looks the same from a meta perspective after this patch, which should excite people. We've been looking at mostly the same cards with mostly the same decks played in mostly the same way for a while now, and this is going to change things. So if you didn't play Mythgard for a while, or if you haven't tried it yet, I absolutely recommend looking at this patch, downloading the game, giving it another shot, because things are going to look real interesting. And I'm very excited about this. I'm anxious to get Mythgard back on stream. I'm anxious to see what else is going to come down the pipe. Chad is suggesting a bunch of ideas for things that both existed pre-patch, that could get moved up, or things that may come back. There's a bunch of things that, I know I'm broken record here, but the world is different in the world of Mythgard, which is cool. We're going to be getting new life in this. I'm excited, and I hope everybody out there is as well. If you have any comments or anything, let me know down in the comment section. And of course, likes and subscribes on the YouTube video do help. If you want to check out the live stream, RTChompGG over on Twitch, links in the description. And of course, you can talk Mythgard and other games in my Discord, or if you're on the live stream, !Discord. I'm hoping we get Mythgard on stream soon because this is looking pretty spicy. But that's going to do it for this particular patch breakdown. Check out my other Mythgard content on this channel, or the live stream, like I said, if you want to see other stuff. But for now, everybody, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and Black Lives Matter.